Well, today I'm going to talk about results from the super project, and I'm going to focus on this issue of land take, which is the subject of the workshop today. The first thing I want to emphasize is that in the super project, we don't use the term land take, we use the term urbanization. And we know we go a bit away from the policy discourse of the official goal by the European Union. But we think that this term is also very normative. It seems a priori unsustainable. And when you think about it, land take in the English term, what is going on? It suggests that land is being taken, which is it's not being asked for. And also that it disappears. But it isn't true. We know that the land is still there. It's just that you're converting it from one use to a different use. And we thought that the term urbanization is a more descriptive term, and it also invites, let's say, reflection on, is this good or not? And is this justified or not? And not just to label it as taking and unjustified and unsustainable. So let's turn to what we looked at in terms of urbanization, how much land is changing from non-urban use to urban use in Europe. And we were very blessed to have a very nice data set ranging from 2000 to 2018, where we could analyze this. And if you look at how much is being done per day during this period, it's more than zero. So obviously, if you want to get to zero urbanization by 2050, you're going to have to change the current state of affairs. Right now, we calculated around 250 football fields per day, which is about 180 hectares. And then, of course, you can make maps. We make lots and lots of maps showing the distribution of urban areas. You see a graphic on the right that's animating, scrolling through how urban areas are growing in Europe over time. And on the left, you see a Schenke diagram, which you see what it's being converted from and where it's being converted to, because we also have distinctions within urban use. You can also zoom in a bit, and that's what we also, oh no, this is over time. You see, if you're looking at, you want to slow this down, the trend seems to be favorable to that. So taking the first period, 2000-2006, that was the most urbanization in Europe, and it seems to be steadily declining. So that seems to be the trend. Zooming in on countries, you see all sorts of different things happening. Certain countries are contributing the most, let's say, to new urban development, and those are all obviously the big countries. You also have some areas which are declining in the amount of urbanization, and some areas which are increasing, like Poland and the UK. So they're going against this trend of general less building. And you see in both cases that a lot of this contribution isn't necessarily housing, but it's more working uses. Looking at rates, let's say in how much you urbanize according to your total surface area, a small country like the Netherlands, where I'm from, the last period was one of very intense urbanization. And then even if you look at the growth rate, how much urban area you had and how fast you're expanding over this area, we also are one of the top in Europe. If you're looking at Luxembourg, also pretty high on the list, number 3 for the first and about halfway down for the second. Just showing that there's so many different ways that you can measure this, and you can also measure this according to, let's say, how many people live in the area, so urbanization per capita, which might be a more fair way to measure urbanization. That's also what the United Nations does when they're talking about sustainable urbanization. What we did in our super project is to just benchmark regions according to the European average. So you have 4 types. One area which is where you have above average growth of population and above average urbanization. That's the red zones. You also have areas which you have above average growth of population, but not of urbanization. So maybe you see those relatively compact development. That's the light blue. Then you have areas which are declining in both, that's the purple. And you have areas in pink here, which you have below average growth of people, but above average growth of urban land. And there you can say, maybe these regions we have to really pay attention to when we're talking about whether or not the urbanization is sustainable or not, because they seem to be maybe growing faster than is justified. So yes, as I said before, we had a really nice data set because it covers all of Europe, and we could calculate pan-European data. We could also zoom in on regions, but there's some caveats here. And that's that sometimes this works quite well for certain areas. So looking at the Netherlands here, you see in pink and purple, those are urban areas according to Korean data, which we used. But if you overlay it according to the global urban footprint data, which is just looking at what's being soil sealed, you see some areas are outside, but not a whole lot. The main urban areas seem to confirm more or less well to it, but it doesn't capture, for example, the greenhouses, the horticulture in the Netherlands. More problematic is Flanders. If you look at this area to the northeast of Antwerp, you see huge areas which have been designated urban, but you see that a lot of it is empty too. So new urban development happening in these areas wouldn't be captured as extra urbanization because the area was, according to the data set, already urbanized. But let's take a look at this area. So when you zoom in on this particular area, it looks like it's already urban, but zooming in on Google Earth, you see there's quite a bit of housing there. And going on Street View, you see this is actually, very low density housing, and there could be a lot more housing being built here. Here, in fact, you see a house being built. This would not be captured on the new data set as urban growth because this whole area was already seen as urban. You also have a problem when you look outside of areas which were designated urban, that there's also some stuff that wasn't captured very well. So this is to the east of Warsaw. And if you zoom in there, you also see more urban development. There's housing appearing, more building, and this wasn't being captured. At some point, it would be captured perhaps, and then you would have the Korean data saying, oh, it's a lot of urbanizations happening there in Warsaw, which wouldn't happen then in the Belgian example. So just those are two big caveats. And so yeah, the takeaway here, I guess, from the super project is the pace in general, if you're looking at just zero net land take, it seems to be declining since 2000. So that's good news. It's more than zero, but there are different speeds within Europe. Another thing is that you can see that you can measure in all sorts of different ways, and you have to be very conscious about that. And the third part is that this data set, although very nice and comprehensive, it doesn't deal very well with low density urban development. And this is very important because this is actually the ones that you're most concerned about many times, because this is often a very car-oriented development that requires a lot of infrastructure and is generally considered unsustainable. And the CLC data doesn't capture that, unfortunately, very well. Now I'm going to shift gears to what can you do about this? We created a guide to sustainable urbanization land use practices to help policymakers think about interventions. And one of the things we did is survey all the interventions that were occurring throughout Europe to control land use and make urbanization more sustainable. So we got more than 200 of these. And then we also looked at 11 places in Europe very closely in case studies. So just to give a couple examples of the 250, a couple on densification and a couple on containment. Malta, for example, at the national level just said everyone has permission to add an extra story to their building. Well, that's one way to really promote densification. It probably would work. There's probably lots of building there. Whether or not this has all sorts of side effects, well, that's to be seen. Luxembourg, we thought it was interesting that they took a different approach, a much softer approach, just looking at areas which could potentially be infill areas in urban areas, and then also contact the landowners and say, hey, you're sitting on a nice buildable lot. What's going on? Would you want to build there? And in Italy, there were some cases of areas that were zoned urban but were not built, and landowners were invited to get it downzoned back to agriculture, and they would have to pay less tax on it. So those are, let's say, densification strategies. You also have containment strategies. For example, putting urbanization caps on. Greenbelt is also a very common one, those types of things. In Austria, they had this idea of an infrastructural cost calculator. And then you could also see what the actual costs are of, let's say, diffuse low density development as opposed to more dense development. That was also seen as a containment measure. We found, when we looked at all these 235, that there was no success formula, unfortunately. That's the bad news for policymakers. But when we looked at the explanation why certain types of interventions were more successful than others, we did see a pattern in explanations. And those are, let's say, the common ones that you may times hear. Good collaboration, that helps. Involving stakeholders early in the process, that was seen as a commonality. Taking a long-term view of things. Yeah, that sort of thing, being also more comprehensive and involving other policy sectors. Then, zooming in just on a couple case studies, we see that some evidence for broadening the scope, that helped, and that helped in Spain when they started with just a very ecological policy goals, to broaden it to economic and social. That helped to garner political support, and visioning involving all sorts of municipalities in Austria in a single vision, that also helped garner support. And sometimes it's good just to have a clear rule. In Germany, they had a 30-hectare rule, which is similar to the zero net land take. And even though it was a soft target, it was clear enough that everyone could rally behind it to a certain extent. And in Switzerland, they were able to put pretty strong regulation in because they had a political referendum. And so they had public support to do this. So that actually helped with the implementation. So in the end, there's a whole toolbox of different types of strategies, and you can use what we call interventions. And each one of these, we've listed some success factors to them. So in the very end of all this, with the interventions, we see that they do matter. It's not very, let's say, scientific, our research on this, because we were asking people, and this was what the stakeholders themselves thought, but they tended to feel that they had an impact. It's harder to, because there's so many factors involved, it's harder to really justify this in terms of cause-effect calculations. And one thing we see is that Europe is a gigantic laboratory of experimentation of policies. So if you look at our intervention database, you can get inspired and you say, hey, maybe this would work in our region. And so that's something that we would invite people to look at. We have a manual, a guide, and also the intervention database. But you should use this as an inspiration, not as a template, because policy transfer can be very problematic. But see, maybe that might work here. And also try to make a policy package and try to not just do short-term measures or just long-term measures, but try to make a long-term strategy and use those short-term measures to get there. And that we saw tended to be more successful. So thank you very much. I know it was quite a bit, but it was a pleasure to run through this particular part of our super project. Thank you very much.